video for week 2. Today we're going to start off by talking about resting membrane potentials. And so we're going to start off here by drawing a cell here. And so inside the cell we have sodium. Outside the cell we have potassium. And so we have something called our sodium, potassium, ATP, base. And so, as you can tell by the title, it uses ATP to pump 3 sodium to outside the cell and 2 potassium inside the cell. And when we talk about these ions, it's important to remember that these ions actually, they do come in pairs. They are at a neutral charge in the body. So we don't have just a positive charge, but we can have a separation of charge. So a good example is sodium chloride. Sodium chloride, it is just table salt. So we have a positive and a negative together that net 0. So, but in this cell, so we have our channels, and so this is a pump. As it pumps 3 potassium outside the cell, it pumps 3 sodium outside the cell and 2 potassium inside the cell. What it does is it creates a gradient potential. Because we're losing 3 and we're gaining 2, so that's going to result in one, a negative charge of 1 inside the cell, a positive charge of 1 outside the cell. And this keeps happening and happening. But there are other things that affect it, like these. These are called leak channels, and they can be found throughout the body. Something that has a lot more leak channels than another. So sodium does have some, but more than anything, potassium uses these. Potassium uses these quite a bit to make their way through the cell, because this won't just sit there and just accumulate potassium without ever moving. So as potassium comes in the cell, it moves back out the cell, which that also actually, because we have our positive charge there, it creates more of an electrical gradient. And this is something that occurs all throughout the cells, and we're going to kind of talk about it a little bit more as pertaining to this Nernst equation. So the Nernst equation is not a perfect equation, but the Nernst equation, it is -61 the log of the concentration inside the cell over the concentration outside the cell, and the 61 is over the charge. So I'll just put x. X equals the charge of the ion. So, an example. So if we had sodium here, it has a charge of +1. So, as I said before, the Nernst equation, it is aimed to summarize kind of what the ion wants. So as we do the math, potassium wants a membrane potential of -94 millivolts, and sodium wants a membrane potential of a +55 millivolts. And a normal neuron sits at -70 millivolts. So we can kind of think about this and kind of explain it as pertaining to the cell. Well, one thing I'm also going to consider is driving force. So driving force is kind of a separation between the actual and what is desired here. So if we were to calculate driving force, what we would do is we take this negative 70 millivolts and we'd subtract the negative 94 millivolts. And that would give us a positive 24 millivolts. And right here, so that's just kind of finding the difference if you think about it. So if we have our chart, so we have negative 70 and negative 94. So that is just 24. But if we look at this driving force, how much charge we need to make up here? We have negative 70 minus 55 millivolts. That's going to give us a membrane potential, or a driving force, I'm sorry, of negative 125 millivolts. And so that being a difference here of positive 55 here, 0, and 55. That's going to span this whole distance all the way up to 125 volts, which is pretty crazy. So this is going to kind of consist and kind of help us understand of why we have action potentials and why the ions do what they do. So if we have a normal neuron of negative 70 millivolts, we have some potassium inside the cell. We have some sodium. We have some more sodium outside the cell. Some potassium outside the cell. So this potassium is going to try coming into the cell because it wants to lower, it really wants to lower that. And this potassium, it having a positive charge, knows the only way to keep this negative number low is to leave as well. So we have a constant flow. So we're going to start talking about action potentials now. So action potentials are the way that our neurons work. An action potential, we're going to draw out a chart to kind of represent what happens in action potential. So as we said before, a neuron is sitting at negative 70 millivolts. We have a thing at negative 55 millivolts called our threshold. This is threshold potential. Okay, and so this is our normal resting point. Our resting membrane potential right there at 70. And as we build sodium inside the cell, we have these graded potentials. So our graded potentials is basically a name for anything that just deviates from our resting potential. And like you can see, it tries and then it comes back down. But when we try enough and we make it past this threshold potential, then we start our action potential. And this is caused because we have these cells that have potassium inside the cell. And we have sodium outside the cell. And we have things such as a ligand-gated channel that will open and let this sodium into the cell. And as it lets it out, the potassium itself is also trying to leave, but it takes a little while for it to leave. And so, as it takes a little while for it to leave, all of this sodium fluctuates inside the cell, leaving us with a high net negative charge inside the cell and a lower charge outside the cell. But then eventually, all of our potassium does leave, and then it goes back to where it was. So, we'll kind of describe this. So this is called repolarization as it comes up. This is our rising phase. Rising phase with our depolarization. We have repolarization. Oh. Repolarization with hyperpolarization there, and this is our falling phase. So as we look at this, so we have our values here. So as we read this chart, so as sodium comes into the cell and it keeps coming into the cell, our voltage goes up. We start getting closer to zero, and we will probably even pass zero. But, so sodium wants a positive 35 millivolts. That's probably not that low. Oh man, there we go. So we can kind of see the driving force here is really low. As in here too, the driving force, 94 millivolts. The driving force is very low for potassium. So as sodium increases in this rising phase, it goes up, and then we hit a peak as these, sorry, we're looking right here, as these potassium ions come out of the cell, and they start coming out of the cell, then we start going into the falling phase in the repolarization, and it keeps going until because it keeps trying to hit this negative 94 until it once again is balanced out by the influx of sodium entering the cell. So we have this sodium entering the cell, which balances out and returns us to our resting membrane potential. But we have labels for what this is called. This is called our absolute refractory period. This is called our relative refractory period. All right, so we've covered membrane potential. We're next going to move on to synapses and what happens when we have that a part of a myelin sheath. All right, so first off, we're going to talk about a couple of kind of mathematical formulas and kind of ideas that we need to know before we go too far into synapse and myelin sheath and what they really do. So we have something called capacitance. So let's start off and I'll draw a membrane. So this is outside. This is inside. And so what capacitance well, first off, just as we've seen before throughout this whole entire lesson, we have these channels. And as we've seen before, as channels get in, there's these separations of charge. And so this is charge. Oh, I'm sorry, I drew this wrong. That is volts. So we could also say that's charge over potential energy. And so as these charges are close together, we have this force that holds them together and kind of affects everything throughout here. And the difference when we have a myelin sheath is it separates that charge. And it's not as strong to go, because you have to go from a farther distance to be able to affect it. And throughout this, we have these different wavelengths trying to continue from the sodium coming inside of the cell. And so myelin sheaths, they decrease capacitance. So as this charge decreases, so does capacitance. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. So this sodium comes into the cell from just from our action potentials. The sodium flows in. You kind of have a sphere of influence. It pushes this gradient down till more sodium can come in from another action potential and carries that energy throughout. We also have some other things we need to talk about. So we have our time constant. Our time constant is capacitance plus our resistance and membrane. So what resistance, our membrane resistance, it's referring to the amount of these channels that are open. So we even have more channels flowing in. And as membrane resistance goes up, we have less of these channels open. So if these are somehow closed, our resistance in the membrane, will go up. One more factor we have to talk about is Ri. Ri is the internal resistance. And so as we're talking about this, so as this sodium propagates down the neuron, and as we know in all cells, there's free-floating proteins. As it propagates, it's going to be inhibited, and it's not going to be able to flow as well. And an equation that we'll use here is our length constant. And I'm sorry, this is also supposed to be multiplication. There we go. Length constant. So it's also using our resistance and our internal factors. So when we have myelin, we have larger cells or larger neurons. So if you think about it, these proteins are really going to block up the way if we have a small area. But as the area widens, it's not as affected. So with this internal resistance, this is going to go down as the cell gets wider and the area is wider. And then with our length constant, myelin really helps this because these nodes, this is the area right here, this is what we call a node. This is where we have those ligand gated channels. This is where our sodium can flow in. But the myelin, it does not allow for any of those channels to be here. So it blocks up the way. And what we talked about earlier, that the resistance of the membrane goes up as these channels are blocked off. So as the myelin is here, it increases our length constant. It also will decrease this capacitance. And so as myelin decreases the capacitance and increases the resistance in the membrane, so this will go down and this will go up. Should be a net zero about. It definitely depends on these factors and these numbers in which we're using here, but it very well evens out. Okay. So that should be all for today. Thanks for watching the video. I appreciate your patience, and we'll see you again next week as we talk a little bit more about these principles in physiology.